We have a number of people. Shall we start on time? We have so many people who came and started on time.
I don't mind starting on time. It's not always my practice, but I'm not against it.
Well, welcome everyone. We are so excited that you're here with us today. Today's webinar is joint between ClearMeasure and Redgate software on managing and automating test data sets for DevOps. And I'm Jeffrey Palermo, the Chief Architect of ClearMeasure. And I'm here with my esteemed co-host, Kendra Little.
Hi, I'm Kendra Little. I am a DevOps advocate at Redgate.
And before we get into the meat of the content, quick free offer. My latest book came out from A-Press, .NET DevOps for Azure. You can find it on Amazon, but if you will send me an email for people paying attention, then you'll receive a free ebook version of the book. And there's a training class also you can check out that's coming up in January in Austin, Texas. And the URL is there on the screen. And if you miss it, you can see the recording that we'll send out. Also, if you are not a subscriber to the Azure DevOps podcast, go look it up in any podcast directory. And it's for people delivering software with Microsoft technologies and shipping better and sharing better methods and success stories.
I just have a question about the ebook. Yeah. What level of knowledge? Is this beginner, intermediate, all of the above?
So we don't cover programming and how to be a .NET developer. So That is the prerequisite, that you already are a .NET developer.
Okay.
Other than that,
I may check it out. I'm not a real .NET developer, but I like to play one on TV. So if this offer is open to co-hosts, I will probably email you asking for a copy of the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so now back to you, Kendra. There's a problem that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, the problem is test data. And so I love that we're talking about this today because, you know, when I was getting my first jobs in IT, like when you're first starting to get a job, you really just, you'll take anything that's remotely related to what you want to do, right? So I'd gotten, you know, kind of a tech job. And then the first real job I got at a software company, I landed a job as a build operations engineer. And what essentially my job does was to manage the data sets for all of our development and QA environments. And it took all of my time. So I know a lot about why it's hard because essentially it was my job to say, okay, we've got a fairly complex environment. We had a fair amount of SQL Server databases. Some were OLTP style. Some were data warehousing style with a couple terabytes of data, which at the time was a lot. And we were just virtualizing all of our dev and test environments. This is way back when virtualization was what containers are now. You know, they were there and it was oh, this is going to make things so much better. But, you know, we didn't really know a lot about how to optimize them. One might argue that hasn't really changed with virtualization. But essentially, my job was to say, okay, I'm going to set up these environments, including restoring all these databases, setting up replication between them. And it would take a fast environment build was 2 weeks from the point of, okay, I have to get all these production backups. They have to be in the right sequence so that the data in the databases, you know, there's not weird data downstream that isn't upstream. Mm-hmm. So I have to get all these in the right sequence. I have to transfer them from the production data center to the other data center. I have to then restore them, make sure that everything restores properly. Because sometimes in this transfer, right, I'd have them on these lacy drives, and sometimes literally, you know, that you write to a storage drive 100 times. Sometimes you have corruption and stuff. So sometimes they wouldn't even restore and I'd have to start over. Mm-hmm. But eventually, you know, within 2 or 3 weeks, I would be able to be here is your environment. So I think the reasons why this is hard is we need realistic data. If you just try, if you just try to use an empty database, no one can even tell if the app is working. And often the app just doesn't work with an empty database, right?
Yeah, there's nothing in drop-down lists.
Exactly.
To start.
Yeah. And even if you work with a small data set, if it's not really representative of the actual data set. Whenever like you're writing a query, even if you're doing it through an ORM, how do you tell if it's pulling back the right results if the data in your dev and test environments is literally nothing like production?
Mm-hmm.
So it needs to be realistic. And if you care at all about performance, you want it to be really realistic. But then it's tricky. How do we get that over there? And then there's the whole issue of privacy and sensitive data as well.
Right.
What if, and this happened to us, what if we are just taking copies of production and we're putting them in our dev and test environments? And then, I mean, it could be anything from, what we did was we accidentally emailed all our customers something goofy from a dev and test environment. Like a tester didn't understand that those email addresses were all real.
Yeah.
So,
and they were real.
Yeah, that was a little embarrassing. So then we started masking that. But then also, this is very vulnerable data because people don't tend to protect the data in dev and test environments very much.
Mm-hmm.
So if I or you or any of our viewers were going to hack into a company's data, like if you were attempting a data breach, what would you try? Like if you thought about it, probably a phishing attack to get someone's network credentials would be the easiest thing, easier than figuring out how to hack in through the front end. And if you can get to their dev and test environments and there's real data in there, yeah.
And even if there's not real data, you're going to find a SQL Server backup file somewhere. Even if someone did manually desensitize that data when they restored it, well, guess what? The raw backup is probably there somewhere.
Right. Yeah. So we need a way to protect everything that has the sensitive data in it, especially if we're in industries that require it. But even in other industries, data breaches can be not only expensive, but just really bad press. They affect consumer patterns at this point. So, yeah, you got to protect that data. So it's difficult. And then the other issue is that when development environments are down because you're refreshing this data, it's very expensive to the company if that means that teams can't work.
Right.
So I learned this the hard way because when I was doing one of those environment resets, I was being sort of a good employee and I was working on a Friday evening in front of the TV. And we had written some homegrown apps to help with this whole process. And essentially I edited an XML file, which is, some things haven't changed in tech, right? Maybe it's a JSON file now, but it's essentially the same. And then running a bunch of automation. And I was just going to kick this process off that was going to run through the weekend, but I screwed up my configuration in the script and I screwed up half of one team's dev environment. Like I basically just accidentally blew it away and we didn't back up the dev and test environment. So there was no way I could get this back. And I had to wait all weekend and then go in on Monday and say, okay, here are your choices. You could have a fully functional environment and I'll try to get it to you within 2 weeks. Or you could have half of an environment and sort of do your best towards the end, because we were working on, longer sprints at that point. Mm-hmm. And because the 2 weeks would have been so, like they literally wouldn't have been able to do much of anything for 2 weeks. They basically said, we will just sort of figure out how to make this work without being able to properly test. Because the expense, it would have been like 8 developers who wouldn't have been able to do anything for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And that company expense was just super high. And that's when I learned that although dev and test data is hopefully not as valuable as production data, having it offline is still incredibly expensive. So however you set this up, whatever tooling you use, whatever you take away from today, what you want is a way to make sure that you always have the ability to either recreate an environment very quickly or you have a backup environment that you can use so that you don't end up in that situation I was in, because that was kind of a career low.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's a moment in my career where my body literally felt a wave of stress in every square inch of my skin when something like that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't get fired. Nothing bad happened to me, but I still, like, when I remember that, I still kind of feel the ground open up a little bit underneath me. So there's benefits to taking advantage of this. So by doing this the right way, you can help your organization be better, but also you really want to make sure that you're not in that position where you're at risk of having people go idle or not being able to use what everyone kind of knows are the proper testing and validation activities. You're right, where you just have to throw stuff in production and hope it works.
Yeah.
You don't want to be the one who is responsible for that.
Now we have some cool demos of the strategy. So that's coming. But we want to set the stage at what problem we're trying to tackle here. And in my mind, we can split it up into 3 different concepts. The first is, how quickly can we get to the point where an environment is ready for testing, validation, making sure that a new build works and that we didn't accidentally break something. That's the first one, provisioning, under the category of provisioning, provision and deploy. The second category is cycle time through running tests over and over again. We do stuff. Now our environment's in a in-between state. We want to revalidate. How do we reset? How do we get back to where we were? And then the third category is security. Is that privacy and taking care, being a good steward of any sensitive data and making sure that we don't compromise. Those are the 3 categories that I separate in my mind.
Yeah.
I'm missing a 4th.
Oh, do you just feel that we need 4?
No, I like 3.
I like 3 too. I mean, the first category of provisioning, the interesting thing about that one, assuming you have answers for the other 2, but the interesting thing I think about the provisioning category is that it has so many possible use cases. And if you figure out a good way to do the provisioning flexibly, you can start using it in a bunch of different ways that evolve with pipelines, with different automation options. So I feel like you have 3 categories. That first one is a really rich one, which makes it particularly interesting to dive into. But yeah, I really like that, right? Because we can provision environments for sandboxes for individual users. We can provision environments on the fly for builds and for testing. We can provision, environments for user acceptance testing on the fly now, so that all of these things can be dynamically generated, and then we just do away with them. So gone is the day of, oh, I forgot about that thing over there. What is that? Right. So I think a subset of provision that you could make this its own category is disposal. There's reset, there's also disposal, but maybe that's a subcategory of provision, actually.
Well, why don't we provision? Because if we don't have the capability to provision, then it's really hard to move on and talk about resetting or generating data or whatnot.
And we've got to provision in one way or another, whether it's an old-fashioned database restore or something else, we have to provision.
Right. Yeah. And so the assumption that we're talking about here is that somebody is working towards or already has for themselves a automated DevOps pipeline. And so this what you see on the screen here is actually 1/3 of an overall architectural poster for what your DevOps environment should look like. And if anyone's interested in the high resolution PDF of the full poster, I mean, you could take it to a print shop and get it made 2 feet by 3 foot or put it on your wall. Just look for the URL in the chat window, and our assistant Rain is gonna provide that, and you can also ask for it if you have any trouble whatsoever. And I'll just show the full version here. That's the top third, and this is kind of what it looks like, and it shows you overall what things that you should think about in your DevOps environment. So I'll just go over a few pieces really briefly. The headwaters of a DevOps pipeline, with that water analogy, pipeline moves water. The headwaters is your version control system. You have to organize that appropriately, and then from there, we need to have a private build process, even before integration build. If you go back to the 2006 continuous integration book from Addison Wesley, in continuous integration, the step before your integration build was the private build. It was, what is the build process that every engineer runs locally, even before thinking about sharing code with the rest of his team. And so the private build, that's actually where provisioning the database starts, because we need to provision a working database locally on our workstations.
Yeah.
And so we have to have that. And then the integration build, we package a release candidate, and then we flow through a series of environments. Your environment should have a minimum of 3 environments, because you need one of each type. Everybody knows production, you need at least one production environment. Backing off from that, we need a manual test environment. You need at least one of those. Backing off from that, we need a test automation environment, which is lacking in a lot of places, but you need at least one of those, because a lot of test suites require a fully deployed application and all of its dependencies in order to execute. So this kind of shows that. And then we'll talk about SQL clone in a little bit, how it can pull and snapshot production data or data from any environment, and then provision that data, create a database, and constantly reset that. But that's kind of where that fits in the pipeline. So if you'd like a copy of this poster, then go ahead and look at the URL in the chat.
Yeah.
And a question from Brian: are we going to get a copy of this deck, or do I need to do screenshots? You will get a copy of this deck. Thanks for asking. We'll follow up and email that out. So.
Yeah. So there's something that you mentioned that I really want to highlight for folks, and I want to give you a URL to help with this. I'll pop this in the chat window after I talk about it, is that when you're tackling this problem, you should also tackle the traditional problem of the shared development database. So this is a long-standing Troy Hunt, who's the creator of the Have You Been Pwned website. He has this article that I'm going to give you the URL for called The Unnecessary Evil of the Shared Development Database, where he points out all of the reasons why it makes no sense for developers to be doing their work all against one database. And there's many problems. Some are technical. It's like the problem of the last writer wins. And then some of them are just like, it blocks innovation, because if I'm a new developer on a team, maybe I'm very experienced, but I'm new on this team, I don't want to inconvenience other people. I don't want to look dumb. So I'm going to take very few risks, and I'm just going to, try to do the safest thing that I know the best, which maybe isn't the best change, right? But if I have my own private place to work, I can actually be like, oh, what if I do this crazy thing? It just might work. And I have no risk of, if I can truncate the tables, I can update the data, I can do whatever I need to do to test it without blocking other people. So this long-standing practice of, we use this shared database as our sandbox, that needs to go away. And it will dramatically improve your team's life if that goes away.
Yeah, agreed. For the database, it is tantamount to everyone modifying the same set of source code files on a network share.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you do one thing, and now the whole thing won't compile. Well, that's what happens with the shared database. You do one thing, and now other people are broken.
And there's just no reason why we should be doing that, whatever tooling you use. Like whether you use the tooling we're talking about here today, whether you use something else, get rid of the shared development database and your life will improve however you handle it.
And so and we don't have time to go into in today's webinar. There is a past webinar that we've done around SQL change automation, which is the arguably the best database migration tool on the market. And there's some free and open source tools that work in other environments, but when you get into the really complex database environments, that's kind of the only game in town that can really handle the complex situations. But that assumes that we're not using that shared development database, and that we're putting the schema of our database in the version control repository with the application code, and we're packaging up and testing and deploying it using the same techniques. And so in object-oriented programming, it's just like having the definition of a class and then the instance of the object that the class describes. And so your workstation has an instance of that database schema, but the schema is what's stored in source control. And we can create as many databases as we need to from that schema, and every developer needs at least one.
Yeah.
Yeah, great point. All right, so let's drive on here and just highlight the flow, because as we're talking about test databases, if we have a minimal 3 environment pipeline, which again I can't stress, you need at least 3. Now, invariably, you're going to have more than one. You're going to have multiple manual test environments, the candidate UAT, but dev, test, stage, UAT, there's all common names for a manual test environment. And so that's kind of the general flow, but there are some test strategies for managing test data. And these are the general strategies. Kendra, which one should we tackle first?
Well, let's go down the list. So static data and configuration data. This one you can actually manage in source control if you want, depending on the tooling you're using. So if you're using SQL change automation, or if you're using SQL source control, or even Microsoft SSDT, there's different ways that you can store the data itself in source control, which can be super useful. I mean, for things like the usual example is country codes. I want this drop-down list everywhere this database exists. It's going to be the same set of countries. We aren't going to have users enter this information into a web app whenever we support a new country, should that come to pass, or if a name changes, we're going to update it in development and then roll that change out.
Yep.
In the real world, this turns out to be a very important feature to people. So one thing that recently we released a new plugin for SQL change automation in SQL Server Management Studio. We've had it in Visual Studio for a long time. And the initial release of the Management Studio plugin didn't have static data management in it. It's in Visual Studio, but and our thought was, well, this is an occasional task to edit static data, so we don't need to have it in the initial release. People noticed right away. It was the number one piece of feedback is we really want to see static data. It is very important to us. Even if we only update it infrequently, being able to review what is the data we have checked into source control is a vital operation. And some people use it for things you wouldn't, always expect, things a little more unusual than country codes, like, for our company, what are all the different variety of brand combinations you can have for different things? Mm-hmm. You can even do this with larger tables. You may take different strategies, like we're going to bulk load them into the target databases if there are larger tables, data you want to control this way. But the general guideline about this type of data is this is data that users are not entering, that you do want to control, because you don't want this to be releasing this every hour, generally.
Yeah. Well, architecturally, static data belongs to the software system. Architecturally, it is part of the source code. If it's not there, there's going to be a bug. Because if you have nothing in a drop-down box, it's like, so, hey, are you male or female? Nothing, because there's nothing in the drop-down. So that's static data. Configuration data architecturally belongs to the environment. So architecturally, static data is going to be the same across all environments. It belongs in the source code, just like the application code is the same across all environments. Configuration data belongs to the environment. So it's going to be different per environment. For instance, if you manage users, oftentimes there's preloaded one master admin account that is just automatically there, and you log in with it to provision maybe new accounts or whatnot. So that's the difference between those two. And one strategy is to just have that in there, and your migrations, provisioning routine, SQL change automation, or whatever tool you use, that can just handle that and on the fly. And then you just let whoever's testing kind of figure out how to put any other data. And that's the first strategy. Very thin. Right. And a lot of people do it because test data is hard.
Well, yeah. And when you're starting out, if you don't have anything, this is the most obvious way to start if you have to get going fast, right? Just, okay, we've got the very basics in there. Maybe we're using either filters or dynamic logic to keep the configuration data in the right place. But like, here's the thing, try to make it work. Mm-hmm. It's not going to work very well. But, you know, it is definitely better than nothing. So I think that's sort of entry level. Generating test data through the app layer is something that I've had people do before. One of the issues is often just that it can be quite time consuming to build up a realistic amount of data for the database. But for small databases, this could actually be a good approach. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if you just need a very minimal amount of data and you want it to be entered through the application layer. And there's some automation options with this one, right?
Yes. And actually a quick demo, just so if people don't know what this is, I want to show you what this is. And I'll open up.
Because you don't want to do it with a mouse.
Right.
That would be literally the worst.
Exactly. So I'm actually going to pull up an application that's been used a ton for some training courses called Clear Measure Bootcamp. And in the integration test project, and it's just an in-unit project, there's a file, and by convention, over the last 10 years, I think a lot of people use this convention for this pattern. They pref it with a Z because, well, really older test frameworks used to run test classes in alphabetical order, but that's really the only reason why the convention starts with a Z. But there's just a test called, populate the database, and it's just using C# and using whatever object relational mapper to create an object and throw it at the database, and then we can see this is an expense report application, and so we have some users. We're creating some expense reports, and we're doing it in a loop so that we have some number of expense reports. And then if we just go up here and run the test, that's all it takes. It's just a method. I mean, you could have a C# console app or a store procedure. Well, not a store. If you're using the application's data layer, then you want to do that. So we've run it. And now if we go over to our database and go into, say, the employee table or the expense report table. I'm in the wrong database. We'll see that I'm just going to run the app because I've been switching databases.
And for greenfield development, where you don't have real production data, this is your option, right?
Right. Actually, I've been doing a lot for this. I had to cookie. There we go. All right. So notice that I was one of the users that we created. And obviously there's no password here, but I was one of the users. I log into the application, and now I already have some expense reports in my name because I just generated them. And if I go and there's a draft expense report and I submit it, now I've submitted it. If I run that routine again, it's going to reset my data. So this is good if you just need, at the developer level, need to do some quick functional level testing of individual features. And so you don't need a massive amount of data just to make sure that a new screen works. And so that's a viable strategy, even if used in coordination with some other strategies.
Yeah. And you are going to end up with data like foo, right?
Yeah.
Or e pluribus unum or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, definitely very useful in terms of greenfield apps. And some people may prefer to work with very small amounts of data sets or very small amounts of data in certain situations. So if, for example, your production database is, 10 terabytes, you may say, when I am first working in my own private development environments, even if I can use technology to have a clone of a 10 terabyte database, maybe I don't want to start with that. Maybe I actually want to start working and iterating fast with a smaller data set, more like this. And then once I'm like, yeah, I think I know how I want to do this, then I'm like, yeah, now I want to provision something more realistic and see how it does on that. And that's once you get going with this, you will get that kind of flexibility, and you'll get ideas of, oh, we can start making this, yes, a little more complex, but giving more options to people if we have these extremely large production environments where we do use an approach like this for some of our very early iterations of a development environment.
Yep.
Yeah.
And just a final thought on that. If you integrate it in with one of your in-unit or X-unit test suites, and you're running unit tests and component level integration tests in your private build script, and every time you run your local private build, it finishes by not only saying it succeeded, but it finishes with a newly created local database with whatever data that was generated in that database, so that when you're in Visual Studio, you hit Control F5, you run the application locally, it always has enough data for the application to run in exactly the state that you as a team have determined is that minimal set of data. So you're not futzing around locally with an empty database with nothing in dropdowns.
Yeah. This is so someone used a term at a conference that I really liked, minimum viable data set.
Yeah.
I like that. What is for a database? And if our actual database is a reasonable size, maybe our minimum viable data set is actually the data set itself that's been, masked and cleansed. If it's a very large database, maybe it's something else. So you kind of are going to make different choices depending on what is production like, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Other options. Have we covered full system tests? We haven't covered full system tests yet.
We haven't. Let me show that real quick. And this is a .NET Core application, which I'll show you what it looks like. It's a very simple, this is actually the application in the .NET DevOps for Azure book, and all it consists of is a way to create a new record and put it in there, and see right there. Now, what we do here is, instead of generating the data through C#, we have full system tests through the UI. These are Selenium tests. And if I run them, now that I've run the app, and again, let's make sure everything comes on the right screen. All right, so my hands are in the air. It's this, and this robot should be pulling up.
I'm not doing anything either.
Exactly.
I do have some weird green.
So the robot, the full system test is using Selenium to actually go through and create some records. And so that's another viable way, because the difference here is we're not just using the data layer and saying, what distribution of records do we need? We're actually using the full application like a real user. And so the data behind the scenes is being put into place. Now, a lot of applications, I'll go back to the slides. A lot of applications need data not only in the transactional tables, but as transactions are happening, they're also transforming those into reporting databases or star schemas in denormalized way and flowing those things through. And if you're using your application's data layer, sometimes you don't put data everywhere, because you are designing the record at the schema level, whereas your application, when you do a user does a transaction, data may be flowing everywhere. And so it's just something to think about when you're generating data from scratch. So if before we get to production data, if you're thinking, okay, what's the distribution of this database going to be? Maybe you haven't even gone to production yet. And so you don't know how this is going to shape out. You don't even know how to do performance testing, but you do have a suite of full system tests that exercise every function in the application. If you put that on a loop and just ran it for a long time, you're going to end up with a really large database, and you're going to get the general distribution for which tables end up being really big and which ones don't. And so that can be a way to generate a database from the start before you actually are to the production stage where you have a massive database there.
Yeah. We actually tried to do this back in the day. Well, we did this, and it was very useful for a lot of reasons. So this is something that we did because it would help us also just identify, flaws from the testing, right? But we did attempt to use it to generate data sets for our use. The problem that we ran into was, like you said, it's good for those initial cases, but the problem is with ongoing development, every time you add a column, every time you make a schema change, this takes a long time, and you don't
It's
really
slow.
want to run through this whole, be like, okay, we have to take another 3 days, because it has to
That's
click,
right.
it has to load the app, and it's
the slowest
even with a
option.
computer doing it is only so fast.
That's right.
So yeah, it works great for the scenario you described, but what we found was it didn't really scale enough for us to use on a regular basis in an active development environment. It was much better to start taking the production data and using it to regularly refresh the development environments.
Oh yeah. Of the automated techniques, it is the slowest.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But very valuable to do for a bunch of different reasons for testing purposes. Like, yeah, the days of, manually doing this are thankfully gone.
All right. Next one.
Yeah. The next one is generating the data directly.
All right. And we have a shiny Redgate product that's actually really awesome that's been around for a long time. And
it's a classic.
It is. It's SQL Data Generator. And so for this one, you can see this is the schema of the very simple expense report application that I showed, that you just submit an expense report. And I've run it, and it just runs. It has no idea what the application code is. But if I just look at the expense report application, it has guessed at what all of the columns mean and what some viable data may be. Now we see some lorem ipsum in a description field based on the length. And we have a title of an expense report that it didn't get quite right, because title could be that. And so we can easily come back and say, okay, what's going to be more realistic? And it has all kinds of different sets of data. And, you could just pick one, or, there's so many options, because this product has been around for so long that, if I were to pick like the title of the expense report, why are we submitting an expense report? Oh, for poultry. And so it's really interesting, and it handles foreign keys. So we need an employee for the submitter and another employee for the improver, whoever their supervisor is. So this is one viable strategy, and it can provision and generate just mountains of data that will be correct with the schema. So this is another viable option to get going when you just need a representative data set.
Yeah. And some people in some industries, I have worked with some customers who've said, this is our only option for non-production environments, because they are just forbidden to do anything at all with production data outside of production. So if you have a requirement that says, you cannot, even if you mask or de-identify, even if you sanitize the production data, some folks are just not allowed to do anything with it. And so techniques like this, where essentially what you do is you set up the data generation sets and you just craft them so that you do have a good data distribution, and you are, have edited things like those regular expressions so that the data is as good as it can be for your uses. This can be good in that situation. The reason that it can be more scalable than the previous approach is when a new column gets added, all you've got to do is open up your data generation thing, add in the new column, and then generate again. And it's faster to regenerate than what you showed with the full system test option. Mm-hmm. So it can be a bit more scalable in that way for long-term use. And for those environments where this is your best bet, it is absolutely viable. But you have to then have the burden of figuring out, how do we make it as realistic as possible?
And one other thing that I'll just to tie this in with the automated DevOps environment, the files, the data generator project files, you want those in your version control repository with your database's schema. Now you may choose to have multiple versions depending on the need in the scenario, but all of these tools, I'm showing you the UI here, but all these tools have a command line where you just put that command line in PowerShell or your shell script. And when you do the deployment to that pre-production environment, you run that command line and it has the appropriate configuration. You've got the actual software on the appropriate build or deploy machine. And so it's completely automated. You configure it the way it needs to be. And then just every time you deploy a new release candidate of your software to that to that appropriate test environment. This just runs automatically with your deployment scripts, and that way you have a good amount of representative data according to the configuration that you've chosen.
Yeah. We try to make everything as automatable as possible, and it's even going into new territories. So recently we just had our SQL compare command line come out with Linux support. So even Linux command line support, now SQL compare is the first to go, and then it'll start moving its way through the Redgate suite to make it so that if you want to execute the command line for things on a containerized database on Linux, that you can within that container if you want to, or a build server running on Linux or things like that. So yeah,
Who would have thought
exciting times.
Who would have thought that SQL Server would run on Linux? But it does.
I know, right? There's a lot of things I never would have expected that are happening now.
Yeah.
In a good way. I just thought, whoa, Brave New World.
It's good. It's good.
Brave New World.
And the next one's kind of boring, isn't it, Kendra? I really don't even want to show it.
Well, I think I discussed the next one at the beginning of the webinar. So using those raw database backups, they can be large. In fact, they're usually going to get larger and larger over time. They are not generally very portable. Sometimes we have some sand magic to make them more portable. I do want to address real quick, though. I didn't talk about the notion of sand snapshot backups. Sometimes people are like, how can we use production backups in different ways? What we're talking about here are kind of the portable SQL Server backups. SAN snapshots from production, there are ways you can make those writable now, but generally any impact you put on those, they're using the same spindles or whatever technology that the production data is using. I would still stay far, far away from that, because anytime we could impact production, I get really nervous. There have been some special cases where I've used writable SAN snapshots to help make a production change easier for things like many, many terabyte databases because we didn't have another way. But I still get really nervous having any development use that kind of backup. I would much rather still have, if I'm using a technology, a actual SQL, an exported backup, a backup that is not in any way tied to the production storage that I can then modify and use in my development environments, no matter what the technology is. So raw database backups, I think you generally are going to want some technology to make this easier. You don't want to just be using those, but having some separate backup from production, still important in terms of what we're talking about in the next options. But for the reasons we talked about with data sensitivity, as well as just time and portability, you do not want to be sharing around backup files from production generally to all the developers.
And architecturally,
all sorts of bad stuff.
Architecturally, everybody has a database that has some of those tables that are multiple terabytes and they just become hard to work with. But it's worthwhile asking the architectural question of, why do we think that we need 100% of that data in order to test our application? And what architecturally can we change to make that not true? Now, some hotfix bug reproductions, maybe we need 100% of a particular customer's data tree, which would be a shard of that database. But maybe you need all of that customer's configuration and all of their orders, but do you need all of your customers' data if one of your customers is having an issue that may be tied to its data?
Yeah.
So that's an architectural question, and I'd encourage anyone listening just to wrestle that with your team and to challenge those assumptions. And start making strides, because ultimately, if you can figure out how to enable your process and your pre-production environment so that you can reliably test your application without having to do a complete production restore, your cycle times are going to speed up.
Yeah. And a lot of this is doing a little bit of analysis on the data pattern. And sometimes you just already know this. So for instance, one company I worked at, we all knew we had one massive customer and then a bunch of small customers. So in terms of testing, we needed to represent that. but we didn't necessarily need the exact data for the massive customer in every situation. And we didn't need the data for every small customer because they were quite similar. So, in some companies you have that. In some companies, you just have a layout where each customer has their own database, right? That sometimes you just need a sampling of those databases too. And sometimes you have a fairly even distribution, but a lot of times there's someone who already knows, or you can do a little bit of investigation into the data patterns and that'll help shape that decision. Because it does vary, but it often falls into one of these groups, Yeah. So there are other problems, business related, with having one massive customer who you're dependent upon for revenue. By the way, it's not my favorite thing.
Absolutely.
It's not my favorite thing.
Right. Well, it goes with, do you have, a customer is a boss, right? They pay your paycheck. And so do you have one boss that can say you're fired? Or if you have 1,000 bosses and one says you're fired, it's like, man, that stinks. Okay. But I still have a lot of other jobs.
Yeah, it's okay. I still have 999 bosses.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk about restores though. So when you're restoring, I think what we've kind of said just now is sometimes when you are restoring, you are going to want to get rid of a bunch of data before you distribute it. And no matter how you're doing this, whether you're restoring, whether you're kind of cloning or sand cloning, you want something separate from the production data, and you're going to want to almost certainly modify it in some ways. Maybe it is truncating some things you don't need. Maybe it is removing some data. Maybe it is sanitizing that sensitive data. Like we started changing all those email addresses.
Right.
But you want to complete all of this before you expose the data in any way for provisioning anywhere. You don't want to restore it and then clean it. You want to clean it and then make it available.
Right.
And Very important.
I think a lot of people who've wrestled with this over time on this webinar, I'm guessing that so many people have their own custom routines for making some of those changes post restore, but it's just one person has built up their own scripts and they're using it, but it's not automated in any way. And it's just hard. And if that person left the company, well, guess what? That technique probably left as well.
And it's probably not in version control. That's really, I think, the first step. Often this is done by DBAs, and we are not traditionally the best at making sure everything is in version control because we didn't start out with nice things. We didn't. We need to learn to have nice things, though, and version control is a very nice thing. So getting the data cleansing into version control. If you adopt tooling, a lot of tooling will let you still use those scripts. So even if you're planning on changing the way you do this, those are incredibly valuable. The logic in those is absolutely something you want to immediately say, okay, we're going to get this into a repository somewhere right now so that we can build on this.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us to the crescendo, doesn't it? To the actually the SQL clone, what everyone's all been waiting for if they read ahead.
Let's see it.
Which we have a good demo of that. So the last one, restore from a version, clone, and masked data set. So let's put away SQL data generator, and I'm actually going to use the expense report application and pull up SQL clone, and that is over in this window here. All right, and you install it locally or on any server, and it actually shows up as a web application. But your dashboard, you can see that I've already created a 2 images, one for the Onion DevOps Architecture Database and one for ClearMeasure Bootcamp, which is our expense report application. But I'll just go through and I'll create a new image, and I'll just do it straight from the database server. And we'll go from our database, it's checking for compatibility. And this is where data mask comes in. And I want to show that because that is so powerful. And you can write your own scripts, but let's look at how data mask can just be handled really automatically. Now I've already created the new rule, but if I go into this rule, and it's a substitution rule on the employee table, I've said, I have an employee username, first name, last name, email address. let's say that that's sensitive data in my organization and I really don't want the real data to be there. Well, it's as easy as, I'll just enlarge this. It's as easy as just selecting the column and saying, okay, username nvarchar50. Well, what type of strategy do I want to use out of all of these options? And so I've just chosen, you know what? I'm going to get surnames. I'm going to use the large list, uppercase, and then I'm going to have unique values only because I don't want any duplicates. And then for first name, well, it's first name, male and female, and then last name, the surname's email address, random. And so I can, if you want to kind of explore, it shows, oh, this is what's likely going to be in that column. And that's cool.
Yeah.
And so it really is, or you can see, you know, you can see what the data is in the database right now. You can see my name right there. So all we have to do is create a rule, save it, and we put that file, that data mask file, in version control because that's our substitution file. And then we drag and drop it here. So I'm going to browse to where that is. And you can see this is in my working tree. In my Redgate SQL change automation project is where I chose to put it because that's kind of the process, but you can put it anywhere. So save that, hit continue. We're going to need to put it on a path. I'm working locally, so this is just where we're going to put it. You'd put it on a network share in order to save it. So we're going to be clear measure.bootcamp. What version are we working with? It's the webinar version. Whatever name you give it. Create the image. All right, so that's how it works. It'll take a while for big data sets, but it's pretty quick on small data sets. And so then if we go over to, 82%. Then if we go over to create a clone, now if I'm going to set myself up for, let's say, debugging or working locally or on any environment, I'm going to select that. And I'm not going to do any additional modifications. I'm going to put it on my SQL 2017. Next, and the clone name is going to be clearmeasure.bootcamp.webinar.
Yeah. And everything you see here, you can do through PowerShell as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just reiterating what we said before, this is all completely scriptable.
Yes. Yeah. And the command lines are under the covers and you just kind of do it automatically, but it's, you got to visualize it.
I think it helps to show the GUI because I love PowerShell, but it's just not that exciting to show a PowerShell command. Some people might disagree.
So if I refresh here, I now have webinar. And if I've show my employee table, select all the rows. Now look, I don't have any sensitive data. Jeffrey Palermo is not in here. So my email address is safe, except for it being on the PowerPoint slides. So if we go over to our application now, which is right here, I'm going to go to my connection string. And I'm going to change the database because we're actually going to test with this application. And we're going to run it. We're going to modify some data. We're going to come back. We're going to do some testing. And then we're going to be able to reset to exactly where the image was. And that's the power. And of course, oh, I have to log out. We're going to log out here. It's got a cookie. This application has a rich history of training. So now there's no Jeffrey Palermo, but just as a trick, I'm going to go look at the first one, Christine. So I know that the first record happens to have a lot of stuff attached to it. So Christine actually has all the good data in there. So if I go to my expenses, I have one that is submitted. I'm going to go ahead and approve that. And so now I come back to SQL clone and if I go to .webinar, you see now it's modified. It already knows that something in that data set is modified. So you can do it with PowerShell, but I'm going to do a reset operation. You can hook up Octopus Deploy with a button on that environment that says, hey, I want to reset this particular environment, and then Octopus Deploy just runs the command, and there you have an environment operation. And so now if we come back to my expenses, now look, it's back in submitted status, and I can hit approve again. So I can do repetitive cycles whether I'm doing it locally and I want to use the GUI, or I'm in a downstream environment with Octopus Deploy and I'm going to the Octopus Deploy dashboard and saying, reset this environment, it's running the command lines under the covers. Either way, this is just a powerful cycle where we can create images in a downstream environment after running our SQL migrations, where if we add a column, well, we deploy to that database, even if it's all the way from production. We can deploy to a target database that does a database schema migration, adding a column, changing something, and then immediately after we've transformed the database, it has existing data, we run SQL clone, the command line version, automatically creating a new image for that new version of the database. And now it's in our suite, and we can take the latest image, restore it to pre-production environments using SQL data mask, which is the substitution rule example I showed, thereby keeping all of the data that we don't want, or anonymizing, however we want to do it, safe. And it's just a really powerful flow to equip our team with.
Yeah. So you no longer have to say, I'm going to set up this environment for you over the weekend. It can be something that can literally be, you would set that you have an automated process that's regularly refreshing and masking the images. And then you have automated processes that just automatically clone on demand when you need them, when you need an environment. The clone uses data virtualization. So the clone database doesn't take up the amount of space the original database does. You only have to use space for the amount of modifications you make against the clone. So your storage needs are way lower than if you were restoring different copies of this database everywhere. So it can really make that lightweight creation of environments quite possible, which is very, very cool. Where we're going with this, by the way, so we've gotten many questions from people that are, so does clone work in containers? And the answer is not yet, but soon. And I'm very excited to get to say that, right? Because for a while, you're not allowed to talk about things if it's like iffy. We have a working demo. We are committed to being able to do this in containers. And the power of that means, like, yes, it's very, very cool what we've just talked about, but wouldn't it be even more cool if you could deploy a whole new container with, say, 5 databases in it? The beauty of that is they can all have whatever name they have in production, right? You've just given the container a different name because, database names do have to be unique on an instance, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So this gives a lot more flexibility and moves us a lot closer to infrastructure as code. So that is coming soon. I don't have a date, but I do ask regularly, how's that going? How's that going?
You mentioned the unique database names. I would just give a semi-related tip for people struggling to get the number of environments they need and saying, you know what, we only have one test database server and we only have one this type of database server, and this system, here's the database. Well, SQL Server allows you to create multiple databases. And so when you start to automatically deploy database changes, then it can be just a variable for what the name of the database is. And you can actually put the version of your software into the name of the database, and then also poke that into the connection string of your application that's deployed to that environment. And thereby, if you are constrained from an infrastructure standpoint, you can multiplex a database server, of course, up to storage and computing capacity. Yeah. But that's a really great way to expand the number of working environments that you have, even if you don't have any more actual servers.
Yeah. And one little tip, sometimes people are like, well, that sounds good, but what if I have like a view that references another database? There's a way you can handle that for free. Synonyms in SQL Server, great little feature, been in SQL Server a really long time. In every edition, they're essentially just a pointer. So what you can do, and this is, I think, this is the thing that lets you variabilize database names, even if you have cross-database views and things like that. You want to, anything that crosses database boundaries, you want to control with a synonym. And then your object, the view, actually just references the synonym. You then have a script that runs maybe as a pre-deployment script that checks, this is an environment configuration thing. What environment am I in? Okay, I'm going to point all the synonyms in this database to the appropriate thing for that environment. And thereby you can easily not have this hard-coded dependency on database names, which you really, for a lot of reasons, you want to get away from. So however you're doing this, that's another great tip too, is whenever you're doing anything that crosses database boundaries, please use synonyms. Well worth the tiny bit of extra effort that it takes to get it in there. Great little feature in SQL Server. I have never found a performance issue that was due to synonyms either. So it's not like views sometimes can cause perf issues if they're nested. Synonyms, very simple in the code base. I have yet to find an issue in 20 years. So odds are good that they're safe.
That's a great tip. I learn something new every day.
Oh, they are fantastic. And nobody talks about them because they've just been around for, they're not like new and shiny, but they are amazing. One
other architectural bit of situation a lot of people find themselves in is a database where 10 or so applications all have the connection string to it. And you think, okay, I'm putting in place my DevOps pipeline. Which applications pipeline does this database belong to? Well, shoot, it doesn't belong to any of them because these applications just call the database. This database has been here for 20 years. Well, we have to recognize architecturally that database, for better or for worse, whatever you think about it, is in and of itself a software system. And when you're putting together DevOps environments, it needs its own DevOps pipeline. And that means setting up a Git repository with, guess what? Just that database in it, a build for the database, a deployment for the database. If you can't find an application that architecturally owns that database schema, because that database has been around for 20 years, that database is architecturally an independent software system, and the other applications merely integrate with it by way of connection string. And then when you realize that and set up your DevOps pipelines, it all works great now, but then architecturally you can say, do I want to start changing that over time? Do all 10 of those applications really need the full connection string? Or do I have some segmentation of the schema that I can start teasing apart? But either way, if you have one of those big databases where you can't find a home for it, then it may be that you need to recognize that it's its own independent thing and create a pipeline dedicated just for it. And then all of these techniques have a home.
So sometimes people worry that that's going to create a problem. So another way to say this is sometimes people are like, Kendra, I really want to release my database changes and my application changes always together. I want to deploy them at the same time. Like that is the end goal. And this is one that from experience, like way back when we were starting doing Agile for the database, what we learned from experience is you never want to do that unless you absolutely have to. Because for database changes, if you want to not get paged in the middle of the night, if you don't want your customers to experience problems, your best bet is really releasing backwards compatible database changes before the app changes go out and separating those deployments. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is very useful to have pipelines for them both or have them in the same pipeline so that you can create a usable test environment so that you can build them both. But having them really tightly coupled is not a benefit. I only want to do that if I don't have another choice, like it's getting deployed at a customer site and I only have so many deployment windows or something like that, right? But generally, you do want to separate your deployments for these. And then, in your pre-environments, your non-production environments, you need to be able to do both for validation. But generally, when it comes to production deployments, if I have a choice, I always want to be running that database pipeline in a different deployment window than the application deployment pipeline personally.
I think that's the only viable strategy for a zero downtime deployment process. Yeah. Because if you're adding that new database column at the same time with the application code that relies on that column being there, you're going to have some users whose transactions get blocked or error out because you're just going to have time where the two don't match. And so, if we can add the optional with a default value column first, and then come behind it and then modify the application. Well, now we've broken that time-based dependency, and people going for zero downtime scenarios now have a chance.
Yeah. And to make time coordination easier, feature flags come in useful. So you can do things like, yeah, the app code's out there, but it is not lit up at all. And you just test and make sure this will work without the database changes.
Yeah.
Then you deploy the database changes, which are also backwards compatible. And then eventually you just light things up with the feature flag. So that's the pattern that we grew into with a lot of trial and error.
Right. And if you don't like
that
anything,
allowed people to sleep at night.
and if you guys on the webinar don't like anything that we said, any of these solutions, you can go with the last option, which is wing it.
I mean, especially when you're starting, sometimes you do need to deploy that. You just, when things go wrong, when you wing it, then maybe bringing up the other options, being like, okay, here's what we can do so we don't have to do that again in the future.
Right. Exactly. All right. And we don't have on the slide. Kendra, where can people find you on Twitter and email?
I am kendra.little@redgate.com. On Twitter, I am Kendra_little. And I have a blog, littlekendra.com as well. So lots of places to find me. But yeah, first name dot last name at Redgate gets most of the folks at Redgate if you ever need to contact us. Thank you so much for having me today. This has been really, really fun.
Absolutely. This is man, I wish early on in my career somebody kind of laid out, hey, just do it this way. Here's your options, pick one. Because this is challenging stuff. And I think over the last 5 years, the number of people in the software industry has literally doubled. So there's a whole lot of people who kind of are making this journey just in recent years, and more to come. Yeah. And so these are common challenges, but there's some tried and true solutions available just for the taking, and products that go along with them. So now at your Redgate, you guys make great database products, and we use them all the time with our clients. We're a services company, and we help implement, design, and consulting around those. So anybody that needing help in this area, Kendra and I can help. Just reach out.
Yeah. And we are very, very proud to have ClearMeasure as a partner. We couldn't do what we do without our partners. So you guys, essentially for folks watching, our partners help us make the products better, as well as help people use the products. So we love feedback from people really using the stuff, and especially people who see a lot of people using the stuff, because the information about how people actually use your software is not always that obvious when you're designing the software, right? So partners are really, really part of the magic for us. It's super valuable. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this was fun, and thank you all for sticking out for this what's turned out to be a 70-minute webinar, which I know is a long haul, but hey, a lot of great information. And if you have a coworker who couldn't be here, by attending, you will receive a copy of the recording or a private link to the recording. You can share it with your team, and please do.
Awesome. Thanks so much, y'all.
Well, Kendra, you have a great day.
I will. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.